People will tell you to watch out for your health after 60. They will tell you to watch your finances, your diet, your blood pressure, your balance, getting out of the bathtub. They will hand you pamphlets in waiting rooms and send you articles about bone density and sleep cycles and the early warning signs of things you would rather not think about at 8 in the morning. They are trying to be helpful, most of them, and some of what they say is worth hearing, but not one of them will warn you about this. Not one of them will pull you aside at the right moment and say, there is a kind of loneliness coming that has nothing to do with losing a spouse or burying a friend or sitting alone in a house that used to be noisier. There is a kind of loneliness that arrives when you are in perfectly reasonable health, when your phone is capable of reaching anyone you know within seconds, when your children are alive and your neighbors are pleasant, and by every observable measure your life is going along just fine. And it is the most disorienting loneliness of all, precisely because nothing appears to be wrong. Nobody warned you about that one. I wish someone had warned me. My dear friends, the loneliest age is not 80. It is not the age of illness or the age of grief or the age when the people around you begin to require walkers and hearing aids and more patience than the world is always willing to provide. Those seasons carry their own particular aches, and I do not want to minimize them. But the loneliness I am describing today arrives earlier and more quietly, and it catches most people completely unprepared because the world around them has spent no time at all acknowledging that it exists. It arrives, in my experience and in the experience of nearly every man and woman I have spoken to honestly about this subject, somewhere in the years between 62 and 70. Often right after a life transition that the world applauds, a retirement, a move to a quieter neighborhood. The last child finally settled into their own life. And it arrives wearing a costume that makes it very difficult to identify at first glance, because from the outside it looks exactly like freedom. You have the mornings to yourself. The calendar is no longer governed by someone else's agenda. The alarm clock, that old tyrant, has finally been demoted. You can take your coffee slowly. You can read the whole newspaper if you feel like reading the whole newspaper. You can choose how the day is shaped, and for the first several months, that choice feels like exactly the reward that 50 years of responsible living was meant to produce. And then somewhere in the quiet middle of an unremarkable Tuesday, it begins to dawn on you that something you cannot immediately name is missing. Not a person, exactly. Not a place you can return to. Something more like a frequency you were always tuned to. A low, constant hum of belonging that you didn't notice while it was there and now cannot stop noticing in its absence. What you are feeling, though it takes time to find the right word for it, is this. You have become invisible to the structures that used to hold you. The office knew your name. The school run knew your schedule. The neighborhood carpool. The Saturday morning team. The lunch table at the company where you spent the better part of 3 decades. All of it created around you, without you having to build any of it deliberately, a web of small and regular human contact that quietly confirmed, day after quiet day, that you existed and that your existence was noticed. You never had to think about it. It simply was. And then, in the space of a few months, most of it is gone. I spoke with a man recently, a retired engineer from Ohio, someone who had spent 40 years solving complicated problems for a living, who described sitting at the kitchen table on what should have been an ordinary morning and realizing that he had not had a conversation longer than 3 minutes in 4 days. He had the health. He had the pension. He had the wife he loved and the house he had wanted and the grandchildren who visited on holidays. None of that was gone. But the daily fabric of being known, of walking into a room where people looked up because they were expecting you, of mattering to the rhythm of something larger than your own, the private routine that had quietly unraveled, and he had not known to grieve it because no one had ever told him it was something worth grieving. He thought there was something wrong with him. That is almost always the first conclusion, and it is almost always wrong. There is nothing wrong with you. What is happening is one of the most natural and most unacknowledged pluses of later life. And the reason it feels so isolating is not because you are failing at aging, but because the culture you live in has done a remarkably poor job of preparing anyone for it. We have a language for grief. We have a language for illness. We have an entire industry built around the inconveniences of physical aging, but we have almost no language at all for the loss of structure, the loss of daily belonging, the loss of that steady confirmation that comes from being embedded in something that would notice your absence. The research that organizations like AARP have been quietly accumulating for years now suggests that loneliness among people between 60 and 75 is not just common. It is significantly underreported, in part because people in this age group have spent their entire lives being the ones who solve problems rather than the ones who admit to having them. There is a particular silence around this subject among men especially, who were handed, somewhere along the way, the understanding that self-sufficiency is a virtue that does not leave room for acknowledging that you are quietly aching for more human contact than Tuesday currently provides. That silence is costly. It is far more costly than most people realize until the cost has been accumulating for years. But here is what I want you to hear today. And please stay with me because this is the part that nobody arrives at quickly enough. The loneliness I am describing, as real and as heavy as it is not a verdict. It is not a preview of the rest of your life. And it is not evidence of some flaw in your character or your choices. It is a transition, one of the most significant transitions of adulthood, and, like every significant transition, it asks something of you that earlier ones did not. What it asks is that you become intentional about something your earlier life handled automatically. When you were 42 and employed and living inside the ordinary machinery of a busy life, belonging was largely a passive experience. You showed up, and it was already there. Now, for perhaps the first time since early adulthood, it has to be built on purpose. And that is a genuinely strange and uncomfortable thing to ask of someone who has spent decades being competent at everything they put their hand to, because building connection on purpose, as a deliberate act rather than a natural byproduct of circumstance, requires a kind of willingness to feel awkward that competent people are not always comfortable acknowledging. It requires you to be new at something again, and most of us, by 65, have been away from the experience of being new at something for long enough that it does not sit easily. I want to tell you about a woman I know. Someone who worked for many years as a school librarian in a small town in northern Michigan, a woman of considerable warmth and considerable pride who found herself in exactly the situation I am describing. In the first year after she retired, she had expected to feel relieved. She had been telling anyone, too, asked, that she was looking forward to having time. And she did feel those things genuinely for the first few months. But by the autumn of that first year, she was spending entire Saturdays in her car, driving slowly through the town she had lived in for 30 years, not because she needed anything from any of the shops she passed, but because being in motion near other people felt better than sitting still in the house where the silence had begun to press against her in a way that made it difficult to breathe. She was not someone who had ever thought of herself as lonely. She had a husband, grown children, a life that looked complete from any reasonable vantage point. But she had lost the library, not the building, the belonging, the students who looked for her, the colleagues who saved her the good chair in the break room, the particular pleasure of being a person whose presence was expected and whose absence would prompt someone to ask where she had gone. She told me, months later, that she had been afraid to name what she was feeling because naming it felt like admitting to a failure she could not precisely identify. That fear is one of the most common and most damaging features of this particular kind of loneliness, because the longer it goes unnamed, the larger it grows, and the more it begins to color everything else. The mornings, the relationships, the way you read your own reflection in quiet moments. A loneliness that has no name eventually becomes a loneliness that feels like a permanent condition rather than a passing season. Naming it is not weakness. Naming it is the beginning of doing something about it. Here is what I have learned about building connection deliberately, having been forced to learn it the hard way in my own 7th decade. The connections that matter most at this stage are not the ones that happen to you. They are the ones you create small enough to actually sustain. There is a common mistake that newly lonely people make, and I made it too, reaching for something large and official and structured. A club, a class, a formal group meeting in a church basement with a sign-up sheet and a handout. Those things are not wrong, but they require a level of initial vulnerability and momentum that is very difficult to sustain. In the early days of loneliness, when the energy for new things is often exactly as low as the loneliness itself, what actually works, more often, is smaller than that. A fixed time with one specific person. A neighbor you have said hello to for years but never made a proper appointment with. A former colleague you think about occasionally and have been meaning to call since before either of you retired. The coffee that keeps getting rescheduled. The phone call you have been drafting in your head without ever dialing. Those small, almost embarrassingly low-stakes connections are where the web begins to rebuild itself. Not grandly, quietly, one thread at a time. The librarian from northern Michigan eventually joined a small group of women who met on Wednesday mornings to walk along the Lakeshore Trail near her town. She had not been looking for anything so straightforward. She had imagined, when she finally decided to do something, that the solution would need to be proportionate to the size of what she was feeling. But it turned out that 45 minutes, 3 women, a cold lake, and the same Wednesday every week gave her back something she had not known how to ask for. Regularity. Expectedness. The quiet knowledge that someone somewhere had organized their morning around the assumption that she would show up. That is what loneliness is starving for when you understand it correctly. Not entertainment, not stimulation, not even deep conversation, though those are all welcome. What it needs, at its center, is exactly what the structures of your working life used to provide without effort. The simple, steady, repeating experience of being expected. I believe that one of the most generous things a person can do at this stage of life is to make themselves expectable to someone. To become the person who shows up at the same time, in the same place, with the kind of steady reliability that says to another person, "I thought about you before I arrived, and I arranged my morning around you." And that is not nothing. It is, in fact, quite a lot. The loneliness I have been describing today is real, and it is far more common than the culture around you has given you any reason to suspect. And if you are somewhere inside it right now, I want you to hear this as plainly as I know how to say it. You are not failing at the life you are supposed to be enjoying. You are simply in a passage that nobody mapped for you, and the absence of a map is not your fault. The passage does not last forever. That is not a comfort I am offering carelessly. I have watched enough people move through it to say with some confidence that the ones who come out the other side, and most people do eventually, share one thing in common that has nothing to do with luck or personality or the particular circumstances of their life. They kept reaching out, even when reaching out felt embarrassing. Even when the first attempts did not produce much, even when the voice inside them insisted that they should be past the age of needing this, they kept trying, in small ways, to become someone whose presence was expected somewhere. And slowly, the way that most of the best things in later life arrive, the web rebuilt itself. Not identically to what it was before, not a replica of the office or the carpool or the school where everyone knew your name, something new, stitched together on purpose, and in some ways more genuinely chosen than anything that came before it. If there is one hope I am carrying for you as I close today, it is this. Not that your life becomes free of loneliness. None of us receives that particular promise, and I would not offer it to you because I think you deserve an honest companion, more than a comfortable one, but that you give yourself permission to name what you are feeling without judgment. that you resist the voice that tells you the feeling makes you unusual or deficient or somehow behind where you ought to be. By now, that you allow yourself to reach for something small, one person, one fixed time, one Wednesday morning on a trail that someone else also plans to walk. And trust that small is not a lesser version of something larger. Small is very often exactly the right size. You are not too old to be expected somewhere. You are not too far along to matter to someone's Tuesday. And the loneliness you are carrying, however heavy it feels in this particular season, is not the last word about any of this. It is, if you let it be, the first sentence of something better. Take good care of yourselves, my dear friends. Let the morning come in gently, and the next time you feel that particular silence settling around you, the one that nobody warned you about, know that you are not alone inside it. Know that I, and many others who have sat exactly where you are sitting, found our way through it. And know that the way through was never as far from where you were standing as it seemed. Until we meet again.